Hi, I'm Bob Meier, Professor of Sociology at Iowa State University, and this afternoon I have the pleasure of talking with Gil Geis.
And I'm Gilbert Geis, Professor Emeritus, Department of Criminology, Law and Society, University of California, Irvine.
And we get to talk about you and your career in white-collar crime.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it'll go quick.
It has gone it's gone very quick.
Gil, I want to start almost at the beginning. I want to go back to graduate school and have you tell me a little bit about life in Wisconsin, where you got your degree.
Well, I came to Wisconsin really as on a scholarship to study Scandinavian area studies, which didn't give a PhD, so my major was in the sociology department. My minor was in Scandinavian studies. I'd gotten a master's degree at Brigham Young in sociology. I never had a sociology course as undergraduate. I went to Colgate University. Wisconsin, I never took criminology. Marshall Clenard was there and Mike Hakeem, both outstanding people in the field, but it just wasn't what I was doing. And then I got my PhD at Wisconsin in urban sociology, demography minor, and started teaching at the University of Oklahoma in 1952.
Now, your dissertation was on Scandinavian studies?
No, my dissertation was, well, yes and no. It was for Hans Girth in the department. Reamer had left and gone to UCLA, so the thesis was done for Hans Girth, who really never read it until I handed it in. And it was on the reaction of Norwegians to American motion pictures. So it was Scandinavian. I'd done it in Oslo.
Okay, mass communications.
Mass communications.
Okay.
That's right.
How do you get from mass communications to criminology?
Well, I was in Norway on a Fulbright Social Science Research Council fellowship. There were very, very few jobs. It is almost impossible to convey how difficult it was to get a position in 1952. The University of Oklahoma virtually alone offered me a job, and they said, could you teach criminology? And I probably could have been taught industrial anthropology if they had wanted it. So I said, sure, I can. And I went down to the library in Oslo and got a book and spent the rest of that fall semester when I was teaching criminology, staying about a day and a half or ahead, and sometimes, I'm afraid, behind the students. So I'd never have it was an enormous advantage in some ways, Bob. I'd never had a criminology course. So on the downside, of course, I didn't have that background to build on. On the upside, I didn't have the preconceptions that in some way inhibit what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I'll give you one example. For example, the Standard Book. Everybody used Sutherland and Cressy in those days. And it was nobody remembers anymore, but it was a book in which sociological concepts dominated the chapters. So one chapter would be race and crime, another chapter would age and crime, another chapter would be social structure and crime. When we did Man, Crime, and Society, Herb Block and I, we totally changed the field. And those kinds of subtle things are very hard to document. We wrote a book in which one chapter was homicide, another chapter was white-collar crime, another chapter was organized crime. So we essentially moved from the sociological concepts, correlating them with the entire range of crime, into essentially the legal definitions of the crimes, and then correlating them with the sociological ideas.
There are a number of parallels between your career and Sutherland's. Sutherland got his degree in labor relations, wrote his dissertation on labor relations, moves into criminology only after he's asked to at the University of Illinois.
Exactly.
It's not something he gravitated to.
No, Hayes asked him to write a book for that series, and Sutherland decided. Now, I had the same choice. I was teaching criminology and race relations, and it occurred to me it was fairly obvious that I had to make a choice. It was a very difficult choice. There was a lot about race relations that attracted me, but ultimately I decided criminology in a sense was more fascinating.
Okay, so first job, University of Oklahoma, and you're a sociologist at this point, and you eventually become a criminologist, and your professional identity is criminology.
Yeah, that's an interesting development in the field. I don't think, again, it's something that people have attended to. I don't know how it happened. I really don't understand the dynamics of it. It certainly began with the LEA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, pouring tons of money into training in criminology. Criminology and sociology, there were two stepchildren in sociology, criminology, marriage, and the family. And the irony, of course, was that they got the enrollments, which supported the much more esoteric kinds of inquiries that sociologists carried on, but they weren't very highly regarded. And of course, what's happened is both of them have left sociology, and I think sociology is not very highly regarded, and both of them have flourished. I don't mean to judge the regard of sociology, I simply mean to state it as a fact. It's a field in serious trouble in some ways.
Gil, at the same time in Oklahoma, you were doing fiction as well as criminology. What did
There are
you?
days when I think it's all fiction.
What was the impact of that on your criminology? Was there anything? What, did you see?
Oh, I wrote a couple of novels, paperbacks that were published, and surprise, surprise, the hero, this magnificent creature, was a professor of criminology who enchanted all and sundry and solves crimes with enormous ease. Very bad books, but.
Did he look like you by any chance?
No, he's much better looking. Much better looking. He was a fantasy.
You were at Oklahoma for several years.
5 years.
And then went on to.
I might add, if people are feeling impoverished, that I started a salary of $3,000 in 1952 for 9 months. When I left in 1957, I was making $3,500, and people say, "Oh well, that was a lot of money then." It was not a lot of money then. When you start out at $40,000 now, the difference is stunning. $3,000 then was nothing. Granted, it was more than it is now, but it was a very, very lousy salary. I couldn't afford a car or anything like that in those days.
Is that what prompted your move to Cal State LA?
Picture money. It was. I liked Oklahoma. I thought it was a lovely campus, lovely student body, but.
And for a number of years, then you were at in the Cal State system before moving to Irvine.
15 years.
15 years. Okay. And then University of California in Irvine. When did you move there?
1970, 1969, 1970. I taught a year at Albany. I had a tendency to try to get away as much as possible. I think that's one of the real advantages of an academic existence. I went to Cambridge for a year. I went to Albany for a year. I went to Sydney for 6 or 7 months. I went to Harvard Law School for a year, I guess. Yeah, 64, 65. I love those gettings away.
You've been very productive throughout your career. One of the hallmarks of, I think, of your career is the fact that you have had terrific, sustained productivity. There's no peaks and valleys in your Vita. Your Vita lists contributions in a number of areas in criminology. Victimology, drugs, prostitution, bystander intervention, media and crime, delinquency. I'll get to the white-collar crime in a minute, but tell me about those other areas.
Oh, I don't know. It's hard to say in a sense without, sounding like you're terribly self-flattering, and I'm not. I like to write. It's very difficult, but I like to do it. If I were trying to flatter myself, which I am, I would say that I'm really driven enormously by curiosity. Things intrigue me. I want to find something out. I want to learn something. Acquiring information is very exciting to me. So you start with a blank sheet of paper, you start with a problem, and you pursue it. And that's essentially... Now, after a while in an academic career, you become very reactive. People ask you to do things, and you're always fearful. If you don't do this, something else won't come, and you play this game. But I like, as long as it's within reason, I like pursuing topics, and I like finding out things. I like libraries. I'm a library creature. I like talking to people. If I had to do over again, incidentally, I suspect I'd be a biographer, not a criminologist.
Or journalist?
I was a very good journalist for 3 or 4 years. Probably better journalist than I am a criminologist. But it's a kid's game. No, I wouldn't go back into journalism.
In what way?
Almost in the sense like academia is, but much less so. If you're successful, you move up to management. You become an editor in the office. You do exactly the things that you didn't want to do when you went into newspaper reporting.
You move away from the creativity.
You move away from the creativity. You become a city editor, and ultimately, if you're very good, you become a manager of the newspaper. But you don't stay in the field. You don't have the energy anymore, and you also develop an enormous cynicism because you're being used. By that I mean essentially, as I see it, a newspaper reporter reports what people tell the newspaper reporter. They're getting a lot more freedom now to interpret it, but nonetheless, they're still creatures who are manipulated by events. They don't create events. And of course, neither do academics. It's one of the real downsides of academic work.
They're voyeurs who get paid.
They're voyeurs who get paid. That's very well put.
Let me turn to the topic for which you are most well known, white-collar crime. How did you start your interest in white-collar crime?
That's a hard question. I really don't know the answer to that. Obviously, it was politically attractive to me. I grew up in, I went to high school in New York City in the Bronx in the late 1930s. All our teachers were communists. Most of them, of course, that's hyperbole, but a lot of them showed up in the New York Times 10 years later being investigated by McCarthy and this and that. And it was a very good high school. We won, I think we won more Nobel Prizes than Berkeley. I think we, at Bronx Science High School, we had about 9 Nobel laureates. So I had that very standard, and I like to believe I've kept it, that very standard liberal inclination. White-collar crime plays into that. Essentially, it allows a scholar to look at seamy kinds of activities by people who pretend to be righteous and often self-righteous. So it appealed to me. I read Sutherland's book. I've read it 9 or 10 times now, and something resonated in me. The irony was that nobody else was working in the field at the time, and I don't understand that. I never have understood that.
And what time period are we talking about?
We're talking about, let's say, from 1957 until the sexual revolution, the racial revolution, the Vietnam uproar. People just stayed away from that. Now, one of the reasons clearly was McCarthy, because I remember I made a speech once in a little Oklahoma town saying that I opposed capital punishment, and the mail that came into the president of the university was absolutely shattering. You know, send that communist pig back to Russia. So you stayed away from controversial topics. You know, we always called ourselves expendable, untenured assistant professors, and I think that was one of the reasons. I think the other one was simply there were very few people in criminology those days, so that they concentrated on a limited number of areas.
Was it the case that your interest really blossomed in Los Angeles? And the reason I'm asking, I want to find out when you really started writing on the subject and the circumstances.
Well, the GE case clearly is, you're talking about 1961. The article was published, I think, 67. That caught my fancy. It seemed to be a very important case, and I gathered all the material I could on it. But I drifted from it. I think the answer to the question, I'm sorry to be so imprecise, was that when other people started coming into the field, when there was a sense of colleagueship, a sense of that you say something and somebody corrects you, and you both learn from that. It's not much fun to write stuff, not that nobody pays any attention to, that isn't so bothersome, but nobody critiques it in a sense, nobody builds on it, nobody adds to it, nobody refines it, so that you really feel you're in a very lonesome kind of enterprise. So that my interest in white-collar crime really became much stronger when other people started entering the field, when they were colleagues.
But there was a flurry of activity right after Sutherland's book.
Exactly.
Clenard and Hartung and Cressy. Then things tapered off, and it's as though they forgot the field or left it.
I think it had something to do with McCarthy. I think it had something to do with the fact that Sutherland was caught in that terrible bind. It was obvious a very strenuously muckraking book, and yet he was at the university. He had been at the University of Chicago. He was in a sociology field which was absolutely frantic about its scientific pretensions. So Sutherland was caught in a way between the scientism and the muckraking, which was characteristic. He's very afraid of writing that book. He's very fearful. It came out of nowhere. It's a very funny book in many regards. Sutherland had never written anything like that in his life. He was a very meticulous scholar. He was very careful. He did very good stuff. He did very little, incidentally. For a man who is regarded as the dean of American criminology, I doubt that he published 35 articles in his life. The textbook, of course. And his mind. He was a very, very perceptive individual. But the white-collar crime, I don't know where that came from.
Well, he says in some of his autobiographical writings, he started that in the 20s and 30s,
yeah.
did he not? Or thinking about it, not
thinking about it. Yeah, but he didn't do it.
He didn't do it.
He didn't do it. He kept. And he did it, in today's world would be regarded as very sloppy. He simply clipped things out of newspapers, put them in files, and then when the files got bulky enough, he took the file out and started writing. The book's a real strange kind of hodgepodge of of information. You never quite know what it is that he's trying to accomplish.
But Sutherland didn't push the theory. He didn't push differential association at the presidential address. He chose white-collar crime, and that was his last major work. Granted, the field is smaller then, and maybe impact was a little easier to attain, but there's no denying the impact of that book.
Oh, there's no question about that. But sociologists, people paid a lot more attention. It had a public, well, the term. You know, I just read a fiction book last night, and they're talking about white-collar crime, and you know, in fiction novels, everybody understands what the term means. Which is funny, incidentally. He says white-collar crime is his title. You go back and say, now where did he get that from? He has no footnote saying he got it out of a book by Boyd and Sparks. And you go back and look at the book, and Sutherland was a very careful scholar. He cited things meticulously, and he cites the book wrong. He gets the book's name wrong, and nothing in the book at all about white-collar crime. You know, I've gone back and tried to figure that out. That book was published, incidentally, about 2 years before he died, and I suspect he was very sick. I put that proposition to Don Cressy once, and Don, in his fairly peremptory way, said, oh, he expected to live forever. He said he wasn't sick, but his father had lived to be over 90s, Sutherland's father, and maybe, well, he did expect to live forever. But
now, you did biography on Sutherland.
Yeah. Well, Colin Goff and I did an awful lot of work on some. We went back and interviewed some of his students. And,
interesting stuff from that.
Yeah, well, Mary Cameron, for example, lives in New York, was telling us how fearful is perhaps too strong, how timid Sutherland was about publishing that book, because he was afraid. Again, it's hard for all of us to recall it. Edwin Ross, for example, was fired from Stanford University because he made a crack about Leland Stanford and the Cooley labor that built the railroads. Sutherland remembered, you know, W.I. Thomas fired from Chicago for naughtiness. Other people fired for political actions. He was not a courageous man. I think Mary Cameron put it very well. She said he meant extremely well, but he was not, didn't have the kind of courage that certainly she did.
When Dryden Press agreed to publish the book, they did so without identifiers of the corporation.
Yeah, they made him remove that. They made him remove that.
You're suggesting maybe that that was okay with him.
Oh, I don't think he minded. Cressy says he screamed and yelled, and Cressy screamed and yelled and jumped up and down, but Sutherland was much more realistic about it, if you will. He couldn't care. Well, it didn't make any difference, which is what a sociologist would say. You know, what's the difference? Whether they're called General Electric or General Iron, I don't care.
Nobody working in the field can probably talk at length about white-collar crime without talking about Sutherland.
That's true.
And also about Geis, I think, at this point, after several decades of very terrific work, a lot of impact from your work as well. How would you compare? I don't want this to be a leading question, but how would you compare yourself to Sutherland in the context of white-collar crime? Obviously, that you picked up the concept from him. Did you adopt his theoretical position?
No, I think it's still a theoretical position is asinine. My problem always has been as a sociologist, criminologist, if you will, that I really have a lot of trouble with theory, personally. I think theorists tend to be pretentious in criminology as they are in the social sciences. I'm perfectly convinced, I like to believe I'm smart enough to appreciate that theory is excruciatingly important to a scientific enterprise. I know that. Yet on the other hand, every time I run up against a theory in criminology, let's say Gottfredson and Hershey's new idea that the cause of crime is absence of self-control, it strikes me as mildly hilarious. You know, it's just too simple. You know, human life, criminology is not physics. Human beings are much more complicated in a way, and to try to capture in an encapsulated way in a single theory something that explains all criminal behavior, infanticide, antitrust violations, in a single concept seems to me just, well, it takes an enormous amount of absence of self-criticism, I would call it. You know, I can't see how you can, you can say that, I'm picking on one theory, there's differential association, another one. Sutherland says criminals learn how to commit crimes. Well, that's so simple-minded. It's not inaccurate. The way to become a famous theorist, I've decided, is to say something quite outrageous And then every textbook thereon after, has to have 4 paragraphs on the XYY syndrome or on, atavistic criminals because they make a living at that. I don't know. Does that sound cynical?
Not cynical, but general theories of crime, if they're going to be general, have to be maybe too general.
Well, when let me go back a little bit early in that. Criminal behavior is a violation of the law. It strikes me that anybody has to ultimately come to that conclusion. You may say a lot of things should be crimes. That's obviously true. A lot of things that are crimes shouldn't be crimes. But crime, in any kind of semantically honest way of looking at things, and I include white-collar crime, has to be a violation of the criminal law. Well, if the theory doesn't include that as part of it, you're beginning to get into very complex, and here's again on the self-control theory, Hershey and Gottfredson say, well, not only does it include crimes, it also includes drunken driving, smoking of cigarettes, a whole range of other sorts of things. Well, you're explaining so much that you're ultimately explaining nothing.
But Sutherland went through the same intellectual agony, did he not, with Tappan, in debating this boundary issue?
Yeah, Sutherland was Paul Tappan was a lawyer and a sociologist, and Tappan challenged in a very strange way. People have done strange things in white-collar crime. Tappan says, well, you're really not a criminal unless you're a white-collar criminal or any kind of criminal unless you're convicted, and that seemed to be an odd kind of thing. Just as Ernest Burgess. Now Burgess was one of the absolute, you can't imagine how profoundly important he was in the history of sociology. Ironic sort of thing. He wrote one of the most famous book of Marriage and the Family, but he'd never been married, which maybe is an advantage. But Burgess criticized Frank Hartung because Hartung's, well, let me give you Burgess's position. He simply said that one is not a white-collar criminal. Obviously, these people that Hartung was talking about are not white-collar criminals because they don't conceive of themselves as white-collar criminals. Yes. Now, that's a very strange kind of, that if you don't feel like a criminal, then you're not a criminal. And presumably, if you haven't committed a crime but feel like a criminal, that makes you a criminal. And yet Burgess was, one of the leading thinkers of the field at the time.
It's almost as if the theory hadn't caught up with those kinds of statements. In the 60s and 70s, labeling theory would make stronger distinctions about those things.
Well, let me try to answer your question. No, I don't think I think Sutherland was much more important than I've been in the field. If I can come back directly to the question, I think part of it was because he was a theorist. Part of it was that he, and another one of those ironies of scientific work, he labeled the concept so that textbook writers, who ultimately I think are the transmission vehicle for notoriety or fame or whatever else, textbook writers will invariably come back to that. So the technique of naming things, differential association, white-collar crime, is one of the ways in which people establish scientific prestige, and I haven't really done either of those things very effectively. Now, how long it lasts, how long any of it lasts, is very. I remember Howard Becker, one of my the other Howard Becker, the much older man than the Howard Becker who later was to become more well known, used to talk about, I can't even remember his name now, which is part of the story, I guess. A man in Illinois, Hiller, I guess it was, E.T. Hiller, who had written about revolutions. And sociology was very concerned with revolutions, and Becker said he's very bitter. He's retired now, and nobody pays any attention because sociologists aren't interested in revolutions anymore. And poor Mr. Hiller had become the most famous, with Gumplowitz and Ratzenhofer, who sound like a vaudeville team in Las Vegas. They're all forgotten. It's very hard to keep a lasting reputation. Sutherland has.
That's what damages a theoretician's legacy. It's not that you're wrong, it's that you're passé.
Yeah.
That'll kill you more than anything.
I think that's true. I just wrote somebody, some famous man, won the Nobel Prize winner, saying that what happens to theories is that all their opponents die out and then they persist. But one always feels inclined to list them, a roster of theories. And it's, in criminology, the failure to build one theory on another one is absolutely lethal.
If Sutherland hasn't been a major influence on you, and if he has, correct me. If he hasn't, who has?
Oh, that's a hard question. No, I would say Sutherland has certainly been an influence on me. No question about that, because you go back to him and you you know, he's so tempting to pick up those hypotheses that he strews all over the place, which allows you to address some things. I would say people who work in corporate crime, I found that an interesting, very interesting area. I've done a lot of work lately on corporate criminality and the causes and that. So I would say really lawyers. I paid more attention to lawyers. I learned law very early by myself, and it's not very hard to learn, you know, the legal, you know, how to find a citation and to read the stuff, and it's all there. So I would say really the legal approach. That's not a very satisfactory answer.
No, but I can see it in your work.
Yeah.
And so it is satisfactory.
Yeah. Well,
and its work, as I pointed out earlier, this spans 4 decades
yeah, it's
of different aspects of white-collar and corporate crime. What do you regard as your major contribution to the field?
well, the field certainly regards the GE case. I always thought that the fact that that you and I did the second edition, I did the first edition, and you and I and Larry Salage did the third edition of the Rita has been a very important contribution to the field because it's coalesced. Certainly the first edition did what's done. It gathers together a bibliography. It tries to look at it historically. I've enjoyed very much going back and doing some of the historical stuff. Incidentally, I can't resist saying, if anybody's going to be looking at this, that one of the unbelievable aspects of being an academic, and you know, and I've been one for a very long period of time, is the fact that they allow you to do what you want. You know, that the people of the state of California and ultimately the people of the United States have really subsidized me to follow my curiosity wherever it happens to lead me. And I think that's unbelievable. You know, I don't know any corporation that does that. I don't know anything that does that. You know, if I want to do something on insider trading, I can do it on that. I just did something on trade secrets, which was fun. You know, I enjoyed it. So I read all the cases on trade secrets and try to make sense out of it.
Is there anything in your repertoire, the work that you've done on white-collar crime, anything that you regard as controversial?
That's a good question. Probably what's becoming very important in the field is the definition of the concept. And I've persistently taken the viewpoint, which is a political and ideological viewpoint, that white-collar crime, the appeal, the attraction, the excitement about it, refers to people who have a lot of things nonetheless violate the law, the abuse of power. I think the younger criminologists, and I'm not sure why, in the field, somehow or other offended by this. They regard it as unsociological or too muckraking, and they want to. Well, for example, the Weisberg Wheeler material, in which they want to take a legal thing and find out who commits embezzlement. They're not interested in abuse of power. They're interested in looking at it from a legal point of view. I think that's the major controversy I'm involved in at the moment. You know, I mentioned in a symposium fairly recently that Kathy Daly's very, very fine study of women white-collar criminals has 22% are unemployed. Now, I find that intellectually, you know, I don't find it in any way scholarly susceptible to any kind of charge, but I find it intellectually a corruption of the concept of white-collar crime. When 22% of your sample is unemployed,
it's difficult to reconcile.
It's difficult to reconcile with what I think, but only I maybe think is the real power of the concept of white-collar crime. It's the real importance.
But the and Sutherland too, I imagine, would say that, and the attraction for Sutherland seems to be the same attraction for you.
Yes.
He was interested in that a poverty argument isn't going to do it for these kinds of crimes.
He was very interested in it. But of course, as everybody points out, in his book he talks about shoe salesmen, he talks about corporations. He wanders all over. He's never very clear about but primarily I think because of the pressures of the times, the scientism of the times. He did not want to be seen as muckraking.
Was he successful, do you think,
in what way?
Avoiding that, in avoiding that label?
Oh, no. It's so blatantly muckraking. And the irony was that Sutherland had been brought up in a strictly religious family, very religious, very devout, and rebelled against it. But like so many of us, we think we're, children all of our own, and yet very deeply instilled in us are those moral values. Southern was very moral. He was not a revolutionary. He wasn't a socialist, really. He really wanted capitalism to work. He was offended by its miscues, I think.
Looking at the field of white-collar crime today, where's the action today? Where do you find obviously the field has grown enormously in the last 40 years. Where's the intellectual action these days, theoretically?
Well, what always has bothered me about white-collar crime is people get into it, they're very excited about it, they do something, they leave. Marshall Clenard left, came back at the end. Don Cressy left, went into organized crime, prison stuff, and then came back toward the end of his life. I still see that. I talked to Frank Cullen, who's a brilliant scholar, and Frank did the Pinto book, and now he's more interested in prison rehabilitation. So I think it's a very frustrating field. It's a field that presents enormous difficulties for a scholar who simply wants to get published. You've got to write books. Now, Sally Simpson has managed to do some quantitative stuff on antitrust, but that's not easy because, for one thing, you don't have an offender base. So I guess what I'm suggesting is unless you're a book writer, your tendency is to drift away from white-collar crime. Books, for youngsters are very they're poor risk for a youngster trying to get tenure. They want to grind out those quick and dirty articles off a data set. You get a graduate student in and they look around, like Sherlock Holmes seeking a data set somewhere in some obscure place that they can work off.
It strikes me as being similar to deviance theory, where people slide in, make a contribution, and slide out again. Merton had an enormously influential theory of deviance. He's into the sociology of science.
Well, Howard Becker
he's in photography and art.
But Becker's, I think, was almost a lifestyle decision. He said, I really said all I've got to say. It's like a ball player who's a 320 and then he has a 280 season, and he suddenly says, I'm not going to get any better. That's it. And Becker, I think, who's a charming guy and enormously bright, said, I really said all I've got to say. I'm going to do something else, which is and does.
Yeah. But it's nevertheless embarrassing when people give the appearance of, it must be easy to do. You don't have to be prepared. You do this and then slide out again and do something else.
Oh, yeah, that's very hard. Yeah.
Is that the case in other specialties in criminology, do you think?
No.
Do people come in and out as easily?
No, not the quantitative people, because they can sit down of an afternoon over a cup of coffee and think of another way to massage the data. And you can't do that in white-collar crime. Also, the demands are very pressing. You do something on insider trading, and it takes an enormous amount of energy and time to comprehend the field. And then to move into something else like antitrust is very demanding.
Well, it's always struck me as many of these crimes simply aren't as quantifiable as...
They're not as quantifiable, and the information isn't as accessible. You can't walk into the office of GE and start handing out a questionnaire like you can, and that's why delinquency is such a resoundingly well-published field. You go into those schools and ask those kids anything, what's your self-concept, please give us the number of crimes that you've committed. It's easy, it isn't easy, but it's relatively speaking, it's a lot easier.
Because the real delinquents aren't in school that day.
That's exactly true.
Yes. But white-collar and corporate crime is a more qualitative field, it strikes me, as
absolutely.
As opposed to some other specialties in criminology.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the style of work is different.
Style of work is different, and the publication outlets are very limited.
In what way?
Well, if you've read the last 6 issues of Criminology, there isn't anything in there that doesn't have a log linear regression, and you're not going to do that. Stan Wheeler did it with that enormous NIJ grant, and they did some marvelous work. But they were forced, essentially, to get a large database, and they were forced to define white-collar crime in legal terms, and simply whatever was there, they punched into the computer. And in a way, it was marvelous. Well, let me take David Weisberg's recent article, in which he points out that white-collar offenders, Sutherland said, well, they do the crime once and then they never do it again because they don't become CEOs again. Well, Weisberg says, well, they do it once and they do it second time, then the third time. But they're using different samples. He's talking about people who pass checks. And Sutherland's talking about CEOs. Well, you pass a check once, it's quite easy to pass it again, and very tempting to pass it a third time. Sure, they recidivate. But then Weisberg concludes, well, everybody's been wrong about white-collar crimes. They really do recidivate. Well, his sample does. And then the issue becomes, the quarrel becomes, is that a white-collar crime sample?
So it's a definitional
That's
issue.
a definitional issue.
And we haven't moved very far from that.
We have not moved very far from it, because there simply there does not seem to be any definition that attracts a following.
I look at other areas in criminology, and I don't see these kinds of disputes. People aren't arguing about the definition of domestic violence, for example. They're simply doing work on it.
They're doing work on it.
Isn't that what's happened, though, in criminology, or in white-collar crime?
Yes and no. Sometimes they don't argue about the definition because they don't care. You know, look at the rape arguments. You know, with Mary Koss and date rape, and enormous dispute on what rape is. You know, all studies of rape that use the, I did one thing. When you say I'm moving around, you're absolutely right. By pure fortune, I got a hold of the Boston and the Los Angeles reports, the original reports from which the Uniform Crime Reports ultimately were tabulated. And what L.A. was calling rape and what Boston was calling rape were horrendously different. In L.A., they always charge rape. You came up to someone in the car at the park and put your hand on their shoulder, a man and a woman, they charge you with rape on the assumption that you were going to plead to something else, some misdemeanor. So L.A. had a huge number of rapes. And of course, in the Uniform Crime Report, attempted rape also is counted as rape. And, and so what I guess I'm trying to say, and say perhaps ineptly, is that often they fudge the definitional issues. There are 200 women arrested each year for rape. Now no study of rape includes them in that. So that murder, for example, you say, well, I'm going to do a study of murder. They usually do it of homicide, which is even more generic. Well, there's infanticide in that. There's organized crime in that. There's vehicular homicides. They just ignore it.
So you're suggesting there might be a lot of good sense to go back to definitional issues in these other
Well,
areas.
at least to be aware of them. To know, not to claim that you're doing a study of homicide, but to claim you're doing a study of particular kinds of homicide. My answer always has been in white-collar crime that you study particular forms of behavior. Antitrust violations, insider trading, and even then it gets complicated. I don't want to spend hours on this. God, the amount of ink and trees that have been felled and ink that's been spilled on what is white-collar crime is slightly overwhelming.
But necessary, evidently.
I think it's necessary to, I don't know how you get consensus. I think Nisbet, I remember there's a lovely quote by Nisbet, says, after a while you give up and just do something. And I don't know.
Where is the field going? What's the future of white-collar crime?
Oh, it's a field that's very healthy. In the sense that human beings are simply becoming less and less tolerant of abuse of power, partly because they're better educated. I think that's very important. Partly because the media are taking a much more formidable position on it. Pop programs like 60 Minutes and that sort of thing will occasionally spend some time on white-collar crime. I think it's a field that's very much in active, flourishing, and is going to continue to do that.
How do you see your work in the next few years?
My work?
Yes, personally.
White-collar crime? Well, at the moment, I'm not working on white-collar crime. I'm doing a book with you on crimes without victims, doing a boke on witchcraft in 17th century
Okay,
England.
let me rephrase it. Let me make it more specific. Short answer. How many times have you taught a course on white-collar crime?
Never.
Never taught a course on white-collar crime.
But I'm going to teach one this fall.
But you're going to teach one this fall. How are you going to approach that course?
Oh, I would suspect I'll approach the course primarily through case studies, describing case studies, trying to get the students interested, aroused, curious, and I'll talk a little about the definition. I'll talk a little about the history. And I really want to answer the question, the simple answer always is greed, but it's much more complicated than that. Why people who have so much nonetheless feel compelled to get more? Why does a doctor making $360,000 a year cheat on Medicare? Those things intrigue me. They're very interesting, and that's what I want to discuss with students.
Particularly people out of the professions who are supposedly trained not to be
Not to do
oriented
that.
way. We might expect somebody in business to try to take advantage of other folks, but we don't expect professionals to do that, and presumably part of their professional training is the avoidance of self-interest.
Well, and of course, you know, to be fair to all of them, the structure also encourages it. You know, the social structure encourages. You know, professors, I'm not sure how honest professors would be if we were paid every time we advised a student. You know, we may be doing, advising like mad, as doctors do. Every time they have a patient come in, they can charge. Well, if every time we had a student come in, we could charge, we may do a lot more of that. So the only reason professors seem to be more honest is because they have lesser opportunity to be dishonest. It's very hard to be honest when people can resist anything but temptation.
We haven't talked at all about policy with respect to white-collar crime or corporate crime. Let me ask first for a distinction between white-collar and corporate crime. Do you make a
oh yeah, I
strong
think
distinction
you clearly have to make a distinction. I don't think there ought to be anything as corporate crime, but I'm a very lone voice in the wilderness. I think it's a fallacy. I don't think corporations commit crimes. I think people do. I think corporations ought to be held civilly liable, very severely civil liable, and I think that, if I could put it very directly, I wish I could prove it, and someday I may try to. I have, probably 300 articles now that I've abstracted on corporate crime. I think pursuit of corporate crime is an easier path for prosecuting attorneys, federal prosecutors particularly, and that they do that rather than go after individuals, partly, of course, because they have deep pockets, but partly simply it's easier. And corporations will sometimes, individuals will sell out corporations will sell themselves out because it's so impersonal. I think if they and it doesn't seem to make any difference. You convict GE of a corporate crime, who the hell cares? The stock may go down for an hour and a half. Essentially, it doesn't make any difference at all to them. Nobody remembers it. Nobody stops buying GE irons because they've been involved in antitrust. If they're good irons, they'll buy them. Whereas an individual, it really has an impact. So I think they ought to stop cluttering up the criminal definition by including corporations and just go after individuals. I think that would have a bigger impact. I don't know that to be a fact, but I'd like to do research on that area. That would kind of interest me.
But you're saying as a concept, corporate crime doesn't make sense. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm saying it. Yeah, as a policy concept. No, I don't think it makes sense either as a intellectual concept. Yeah, I don't believe that. John Braithwaite does, and Don Cressy didn't. So at least there's some dispute in the field.
So it's not Exxon that's spilling oil. It's somebody at
Exxon
that
yeah.
did that.
And I find it. And sophistry is too strong a word. I find it intellectual gymnastics to pretend that there's a corporate mind. I don't think there's a corporate mind. I think there are a lot of minds that go into a corporate decision, and it is not easy to untangle them. But I think it can be done. I think it should be done.
Is the law the only wepen that could or should be used?
Against corporate crime or against white-collar crime? No. The law frightens people, obviously. It's a very severe sanction. But you're never going to change anything unless you change people's mind. I've always thought that's if I have any argument with criminology, and it's not a very good argument. It was a very good argument, but it's I don't know where you go with it. It's the fact that criminologists advocate particular policies, more patrol cars, fewer patrol cars, less probation, no probation. That ain't going to have anything to do with crime. It will peck at the margins of criminal behavior. It will reduce, let's say we have 18,000 homicides, it may reduce it to 17,960 because it's such a marvelous policy. But ultimately, the only way you're going to stop crime is convince people that they ought not to commit crime. And that's a very, very difficult sort of thing. We all ignore it, partly because we don't know what to do about it.
Let me ask you a work style question. You do an awful lot of writing.
Yeah.
Tell me where, when?
Well, I write easily, which is a big help. I was a journalist. My undergraduate major was in English literature at Colgate and journalism. I worked as a journalist, which forces you to meet deadlines. I studied. I collected, I had thousands of Hemingway books and thousands of D.H. Lawrence books. And Hemingway whether you like him or not as a writer, had an awful lot of very astute things to say about writing. In fact, I could convey any aphorism or something that would be helpful to write. Hemingway always says, stop when you're ahead. That's a marvelous piece of advice, just absolutely superb. You know, just don't wait until you've come to a point where you haven't got anything else to say, and then quit, because it's hell to start the next morning. Get in the middle of something you're all excited about, you know where you're going, then stop. Even if it's in the middle of a sentence, even if it's half of a word. And then you go back the next morning, and it's marvelous. So you always stop when you're ahead. And you know, I've never heard of a writer yet who didn't, you know, Hemingway said, well, I did 111 words this morning, or, you know, 303. Fitzgerald was a inveterate word counter. And that's the way I try to write. You know, somebody, I think Dan Catkin said so, or no, it wasn't Catkin, somebody has on his, oh, Richard Wright, somebody put on his door, 2 pages a day equals a book a year. Well, it may equal 2 books a year. You know, 1 page a day, and you've got 365 pages at the end of the year. It's a systematic application to it, which is. But I always work in the morning, never work in the evening.
Do you write longhand?
No, on a computer. Computer. I could have been a scholar.
You're in the 90s.
I could have been a scholar if they had computers when I was a kid. Can you imagine? I've told everybody. I did a book on a town in Oklahoma called Boley, an all-Negro town, all-black town, all-Negro in those days, in which we spent, I think, a year in the Oklahoma City Historical Library photostating newspapers. Now you could, not photostating, copying them on a typewriter, 3 of us on Royal Portable Typewriter. And you could do that in a week. Now we took a year just copying, you know, transcribing newspaper clippings. So, you know, the technology has made scholarship. You know, I go to the computer now and they say D-text, and they'll give you the whole article on the.
Amazing.
Oh, it's amazing.
2 pages a day, but they got to be the right 2 pages, don't they?
Well, you do it long enough, and you get a fairly good sense of what's the right 2 pages.
Gil, what haven't I asked you that I should ask you?
If you had to do all over again, would you do this? I answered that question. I really can't transmit how exciting it's been adequately. You know, you mentioned that I wrote fiction books. I wrote a couple of the fiction, but that's a lonely business. You know, it really is lonely. And every good writer that I've known drinks himself or herself to death practically every good, you know, because you're always looking for material. I think scholarship is really an extraordinarily exciting way of spending your life. I've been very lucky in that sense. If there are any regrets that I've had, it's that I've had very little influence on public policy, and I think that's true of all academics. You know, I remember when E.A. Ross was writing to Oliver Wendell Holmes and that sort of thing. Sociologists have been pushed out of the, you know, maybe James Q. Wilson is in there, but not very many of us. Partly because I think of the think tanks. Academics are teaching. They're living in Madison. They're not in Washington, D.C. It's always ironic that we don't have a major university in Washington, D.C. We have some good universities, American, George Washington, Georgetown, but not an extraordinarily good university like, let's say, Columbia or Berkeley or Harvard. So that academics are removed from the policy.
In most countries, the best universities in the capital city.
In the capital city, yeah. So the absence of influence on public policy has always been a problem, except when I look at people who influence public policy, that's a little depressing too. You know, you go to Washington, they're all so bright, and they're all so smart, and they're all so young, and you go back 2 years later and all gone. You know, they're back in Macon, Georgia, you know, in law. So, and you know, I've always been a little bit of a Spartacus cynic, that some things that you think are so brilliantly done can have very seriously negative consequences. I don't think any of us have that kind of prescience that we can guess on the consequences of those things that we advocate.
Is that, and that's a good thing?
It's a humbling thing.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
Humbling.
People who proclaim that they know, you know, that everything they're doing is for the good, don't have that kind of advanced information where they come back and fix. Now, how many times have you and I sat and said, gee whiz, you know, this thing is really, especially in criminology, really reverberated. It was lousy. You know, the indeterminate sentence was terrible, so you got a determinate sentence and it's worse. You know, that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, it is humbling. Gil, thanks for talking to me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Robert.